What I want to do today is to talk about some of the principles behind establishing a good quality series of book reviews. That is part and parcel, I think, very much of the endeavor of being a quality journal. And I think that I'm going to share with you my presentation by way of some PowerPoint. So I'll seek to add them in now. As was said in the introduction, I'm the editor-in-chief of an international journal, the International Journal of Public Theology, which is published by Brill in Leiden in the Netherlands. Initially, they were a little hesitant about having someone from the Southern Hemisphere be their international editor, because so often the weight of theological scholarship has happened in the North Atlantic world. But I am the first editor-in-chief to come from the South. And as an editor-in-chief, one of the things I want to highlight with regards to book reviews is that as an editor-in-chief, you have the final word of what goes into a journal. So I have alongside me a book review editor. His name is David Moe, M-O-E, David Moe. He comes originally from Myanmar, but he has been working in the United States. David will handle most of the book reviews, but the final decision on which one gets included in the journal lies with the general editor, the editor-in-chief. And there is a good reason for that. And that is because we try to make sure that the journal has a kind of integrity, a kind of coherence, that I always try to have a editorial which somehow summarizes what are the main connecting themes from one article to another. And we try to find ways in which the book reviews support the theme for the journal for that particular edition. So the role of the editor-in-chief becomes very important in selecting book reviews. Because it is an international journal, I have to pay very close attention to the readership. What that means is that I have to take into account that many of our readers, as well as our authors, come from non-English speaking backgrounds. And you heard a moment ago that we published an edition which focused upon post-Soviet societies. And we were very pleased to do that because that was the first time that we had contributions from Eastern Europe. And that was something that the editorial committee took great delight in. So we were very pleased to do that. But what I'm wanting to highlight is that we do tend to have articles coming from very, very many cultures right around the world. And indeed, over the last 3 years, out of 97 authors, 58 of them, their first language was not English. Now, what that means is that it requires, on the part of the editor and the book review editor, a great deal of empathy. What that means is that we have to try to stand outside our own cultures at some stage in order to understand what is important in another part of the world. I'll give you one example of that. Maybe about 18 months ago, we published for the very first time an article which came from Russia. And it was an article from the principal of a theological college in St. Petersburg. It was on COVID-19. And in many ways, the quality of article did not reflect some of the contemporary Western understandings, scholarly understandings, both in terms of biblical understanding as well as how one might approach COVID-19. But we sought to enter into that experience of, in his case, the Russian one, so that we were seeking to encourage a public relevance in theology in that country. I use the word here, antipathy, on the screen, which really represents a kind of made up word in recent times in English. It represents that you're seeking to be sympathetic and empathetic, trying to enter into the experience of the other. But at the same time, you recognize that there are limits. You cannot fully understand another culture. Now, how does all of this affect book reviews? I have to say that at the moment, one of my sadnesses is that although our articles often represent a wide cross-section of cultures and language and context, so often that is not the case in the book reviews. They tend to be more focused on English-speaking backgrounds and also really published in the North Atlantic world. My interest in book reviews did not begin with the International Journal of Public Theology. It goes back to last millennium. I was a congregational minister, having completed my doctoral thesis, and I returned to my home in New Zealand, and I became very aware that many of the ministers in our presbytery seemed to live in a frozen understanding of their faith. They had been trained at particular periods of time, but they had not kept abreast of contemporary scholarship. And it was difficult for them because of the various kind of time pressures that they had brought to bear upon them because of their ministry. And so I thought, how does one begin to address that? They're not going to have time to read many books. So I began a quarterly journal, which I called Theolit. And all it was a kind of, created it in a kind of home industry kind of way, a series of reviews put out quarterly of contemporary books in a short, succinct kind of way to help people in ministry become familiar in a helpful way, I hope, of what was happening in scholarship. Now, the reason I'm saying that is that there is a purpose behind book reviews. Now, sometimes a book review will be for the scholarly guild. For instance, if you are submitting an article to the Journal of New Testament Studies, you expect it to be read by other New Testament scholars and to be part and parcel of an ongoing academic conversation within that guild. When it comes to the journal that I'm editor of, that is the International Journal of Public Theology, we deal with all sorts of public issues, which means that we are sometimes responding to faith-based organizations. Sometimes there are articles from people who come from congregations, and sometimes there are people who are in the academic guild of public theology, practical theology, theological ethics. So it's very interdisciplinary. And there is also, through that example of the Theolit, sometimes the purpose can be just to help ordinary people in ministry keep up to date with their understanding of faith. And that's an important exercise as well. And it would require a very different kind of writing from submissions to a highly regarded journal. I think there are some basic mechanics, some basic steps to put in place for good quality book reviews. The first is, make sure you get a stable book review editor. When I first became the general editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Public Theology, every year we seemed to have a new book review editor. And that was my ongoing headache, because I only expected them after a while to be around for a year, and then they might go and do something else. Now, I think the reason for that was that each one of them was completing their doctoral studies. And I think that was a pattern I inherited from my predecessor. And I don't think it was, with the benefit of hindsight, the best option. And so I think that when you're looking for a book review editor, it's probably not a good idea to have someone who is just completing a doctoral thesis, although it's giving them an opportunity. But they're likely to be looking for a more permanent position somewhere and be wanting to put their endeavors elsewhere rather than book reviews. They're probably wanting to publish their thesis in some form or other. And so I now have a stable book review editor. I'm avoiding too many changes. And I think it's just a good practice to have someone in a position for at least 3 years, have a kind of mini contract with them, so you know that you've got them for a period of time. And that allows you then to establish contacts with publishers. One of the great questions for good quality reviews is how you make a connection with publishers. Now, the way that I go about doing that myself is that I pay regular attention to the digital catalogues that major publishers put out. So I try to keep abreast of what is being published, and sometimes I will write to the publisher and say, may we have a copy that we can review, please? I also encourage writers to name our journal as one that they would like a copy to be sent by the publisher for review purposes. The author can help in that regard. And sometimes once you get well known, the publishers just start sending them anyway. So it really requires just a little bit of planning to make sure you make significant connections with publishers. The other side to this is that I think it's a very important job for an editorial team is to build up an evolving network of reviewers and peer reviewers. We don't spend so much time on peer reviewing book reviews. David and I tend to do that. But in terms of articles, we make sure that we have 2 peer reviewers. And one of the things which we have found during the time of COVID was that it was very difficult to get people to do reviews. And the reason for that is they had to spend so much time online doing so many other things. It became an imposition. And at that sort of time, an editor has to develop diplomatic skills, because you then have cross-prospective authors asking you, what's happening to my article? What's happening to my review? And we did find during COVID that we were not able to process things as quickly as we could have. We're trying to put in place measures to handle that in the future. It's well known that the quality of a journal can be reflected in the quality of book reviews. That was a comment which was recently made by Elaine Graham. Elaine has just retired from Chester University in England, and she has been a very significant worldwide figure in terms of public and practical theology. And this was one of her parting shots at our last meeting when she retired. The quality of a journal can be reflected in the quality of book reviews. Now, that's a big claim, because you usually end up with more articles than you do book reviews. We tend to try to have 3 to 4 book reviews, and also to make sure that they're somewhere between 800 and 1200 words. Articles, of course, are much longer. But there's an imbalance then between articles and reviews, but the quality of book reviews matters. It's actually a way of establishing connections with authors as well. I think it's also very important in the production of each edition to make sure that the book review is not the last thing decided. Quite often what can happen when you're getting a journal out and running is that you try to get all the articles in place. And I certainly am guilty of that, because I'm dealing with so many writers from so many different cultures. So I spend quite a lot of time responding to individual authors, trying to help improve the quality of English at times, and also the clarity of concept. I spend a great deal of time doing that. And sometimes I find that I'm hard pressed when it comes to the reviews. And I think that's a mistake on my part. I really should be ensuring that the book reviews are not the last item selected, because otherwise you can end up with a rushed edition, and 1 or 2 book reviews might not be quite as good as the ones that you'd hope for. In terms of quality, sometimes the best way to determine what good quality is to work out what is bad, what is not good. And David sent to me one review not so very long ago, and I turned it down. He was quite surprised that I turned it down, but let me explain to you why I turned it down. I thought the reviewer was telling us too much about his own thoughts and feelings. He wasn't telling us sufficient about the argument and the content of the book that he was reviewing. I'll read very briefly or draw attention to some of the things that he mentioned in terms of content and say why I thought, first of all, that was inadequate. And then I will actually read to you a little bit about how he was kind of summarizing his response. First of all, he was focusing upon a potential tension between evangelical and ecumenical. Now, the purpose of our journal really has to do with a public theology. It doesn't really have to do with ecumenical and evangelical, although it could, but the review would need to specify how it ought to fit into our journal's intention. So part of me almost immediately was thinking, this article, this review is out of scope. So I think it's quite important to have that category out of scope. It doesn't really belong in this journal. And he made a lot of generalized statements and sentences which had no kind of real depth attached to them. For instance, an evangelical faith demonstrated in meekness. Well, I didn't quite know what that meant and what it was offering a potential reader. He spoke of a potential contrast between Andrew Cuomo and Jürgen Moltmann, but really didn't tell us very much about what the contrast was. And then he began to list a whole area of doctrinal ideas without sufficiently explaining why he thought we needed to know about them. It was like a shopping list of doctrinal points. And to be quite honest, it left me bored by the time I'd finished the first page, which is not a good thing for an editor to be bored by, well, actually, it was the second paragraph. And then when he began to evaluate, and this part I'll read out, and I'll try to make sure I read it sufficiently slowly. A specific area that I find challenging and that plays a vital role in the book's development is the issue of non-partisanism. Then he jumps a bit. Earlier, the word was, I think it's a made-up word that he made up himself, which is another cross. He called it partisanism. It's not necessarily an important word. It's just to say someone as being not partisan, not just devoted to one point of view. I'll put it that way. He then went on to say, earlier I mentioned that he retains a broadly evangelical conviction. As a student of theology and missiology, and one who attempts to live out my deep theological convictions, I would love to see him pursue the logical conclusion of many of his convictions. To me, it appears, and then he goes on, what you're getting are a lot of I statements, a lot of his feelings and responses, as if all of a sudden he has become the center of attention. And I was bored. And I sent back a report to David saying, I have read this book review and I don't really know what the book is about. There's insufficient content. I don't know what the argument is doing, but I do know a lot now about his feelings and his emotions. And so we will not publish this particular edition. So I think that was a bad example. A second example of a bad review, well, the review bores you. And if you're bored by the review, you're probably not going to read the book, which is not going to be very helpful either for the publisher or the author. I think that one of the mistakes that some book reviewers make is that they progress in a way where they say in chapter 1, and then explain what happens in chapter 1, then what happens in chapter 2, what happens in chapter 3, or they might give you a list of what they think are the key points, like firstly, secondly, thirdly. And I feel that when I'm reading a review like that, it's like encountering a shopping list, and you're going to tick off one chapter at a time, or one item, or one argument at a time. You don't get too much emphasis on how the argument holds together. I think that stylistically, it's a very boring way to approach a review, and it doesn't do full justice to the book. So I'm making quite a passionate plea for people not to write book reviews which start off, in chapter 1, this happens, in chapter 2, that happens, and then in the final chapter, whatever happens. And the funny thing is, I did happen to publish one of the book reviews like this, and I think I was probably under pressure from the publisher at the time to get another book review in, but if I had had more time, I would have said no. What I would have done is send it back to the reviewer and sought an improvement. It wasn't as bad as the first kind of one, whereby he simply was telling us what his thoughts and feelings were. Which brings me to what I think is a good review. First of all, it keeps to the word limit. And I would suggest, if your journal doesn't already have this, you should actually have a book review policy which specifies, first of all, how many words are permissible. And I think 800 to 1200 words is quite a good length. And then I would actually begin to indicate what you like to see in a book review, to have a set of expectations for a would-be book reviewer. I have one in front of me, and I'm going to read parts of it to you and highlight why I think it sets a good example. The first point is that it shows a level of interest in the theme that the book is addressing. It gives a big picture. And so this one said, for some time now, I have been looking for a book that explores how a public theology engages with a range of issues and diverse audiences. Such a text would complement a number of anthologies where a raft of authors explore relevant themes like the good, signs of the times, and the role of parables, as well as how the Bible addresses any one of a number of contemporary issues like climate change, asylum seekers, racism, or corruption. What is happening there is that this book review is seeking to place the book that is being looked at inside the wider purpose of the journal, a public theology. It's making that connection right from the word go. It's not about the person's feelings, it's about how this book fits in to the discipline. The second part of the article, the book review, which struck me, was that it made use of the title of the book. The title and subtitle of George Carey's book on the theme of interpreting the Bible, Responsibility Today, was rather enticing. The title, Using Our Outside Voice, is very suggestive, and it then goes on to speak about the importance of the title. And that has just followed on from how it fits into this desire to have more books on a public theology that have a biblical foundation. And the title does that. The third point is, and this was in the third paragraph, the book reviewer spoke about what the aim of the book is. And I think this is a very important part of a book review, and that is making sure you capture what the argument of the author is. So that I would joke with students to say that when you write a book review, make sure that the author is not going to take you to court for misrepresenting them. Represent their argument fairly. So the aim of the book was declared Carey is motivated by the desire to educate divinity students in equipping themselves for their work as public interpreters in religious communities and beyond. He has come to understand the decision behind the writing of this book as a key moment in my vocational trajectory. So it's partly explaining why the writer wrote the book, but also explaining what its purpose is. The writer, the book reviewer, is not trying to tell you what their feelings are, nor what happens from one chapter to another, trying instead to enter into the point and purpose of why the author has written the book. The point 4 and points 5 both have to do with content. And the part of that has to do with the way in which interpretation evolves across time and across cultures. And then wanting to say after that, how does that whole history of interpretation fit in with the general purpose of a public theology? And so all of that was, I thought, quite well done. Every book has flaws and faults. The argument so far of this book under review has been specified, but Carey, the writer of the book, was also aware of potential risks. He noted, Carey is well aware, of course, that many people use the Bible for all sorts of reasons. He notes how it can so easily be misused and employed to justify wrong deeds. He refers to how domestic abusers can often justify actions on the basis of biblical support for the subordination of wives. And the reviewer then added in a take, and this had to do with American elections, and noted how many American politicians make use of the Bible in public to try and get public votes. And then it led to a conclusion which had to do with an evaluation. This is a helpful, useful book. Hopefully it might generate further discussion on the role of the Bible as a public theology. Throughout the book, now and then, Carey illustrated some public issues. For instance, same-gender, race and whitewash, migration and abuse. In some ways, these issues feature as a lens through which to describe the emergence of a particular hermeneutical voice or an incidental to a description of the method being discussed. And then the book reviewer said, I think that this book has got a very real role to play. And it stimulates me to think I would like to see a follow-up book, which then began to look at other issues in public theology from a biblical point of view and made some suggestions. So what you see in this kind of book review is, on the one hand, seeking to place it inside the purpose of the journal and the disciplinary area. You then have something which explains why the writer has written this book and what its purpose is, and in a sense saying what its audience is. You then get some description of what the content and argument is. All of that, I think the author of the book would have been satisfied that they had been well represented. And then you get the reviewer beginning to say that there are some issues that are highlighted here, and then the reviewer gives an evaluation. And I think that's what makes for a very good review, as distinct from those two examples of bad reviews that I gave you. And really, in a sense, that's just what I've been saying there.